Everybody say hi to Terry and Rachel. Is this flower like in the way? It's like really tall? What's that? Just for Jonathan. Can you see all right, son? All right, good. Terry and Rachel, as you guys know, are Wycliffe Bible translators I'll let them tell the whole story, but they're Wycliffe Bible translators. And they were on the couch a bit ago when they first got back into town, and now in a couple of months, they're heading back out again. But give us the overview first. Like, this is kind of generically what we do, either one of you.
So we work with Wycliffe Bible translators, mostly in Asia, helping sign language communities in Asia translate the Bible into sign languages and other things.
So I'm going to ask the dumb question that because some people won't remember what we talked about before. Why can't deaf people just read the same precious New American Standard Bible that I read?
One of the goals of Wycliffe and other Bible translation organizations is that everyone will be able to access the Bible in the language of their heart. And when we are talking about deaf communities, the language of their heart is sign language. That's a language where they have no barriers to it. When deaf people learn to read a written language, it's always learning a second language or third or fourth.
Wait, I didn't get that part. Say that again.
So sign language is not the same as the spoken languages that we speak. So American Sign Language is not English on the hands. It's its own language. It has its own grammar. The word order is different. The structure is different.
That? It's not just English on your hands. We've talked about this a lot. Why am I just getting this? Go ahead.
It's okay. When we got into it, I think we had to hear everything about 10 times before it finally sinks in and you go, oh, that makes sense. But it's not something that in our hearing society we run into a lot and just know. So for a deaf person here in the States that grows up signing, they learn English as a second language. If you think of when you all learn to read or, when you're teaching a kid to read, normally by the time the kid is in kindergarten and they're learning some of those things, they have command of the English language already. They can tell you a story about what they did yesterday. They can talk to you about what they need or what they want. And so they're learning to read a language that they can already speak and they can already understand. And then our written system is based on sound. So because the kids already can understand and speak this language, they know that can and cat would both start with the same letter because they can get that sound. But for someone who knows sign language, there's no relationship between can and cat. So there's no reason that those two words would be written in a similar fashion. So every word they have to memorize what it means, and there's no sound to link it to, and it's a foreign language. So all of that put together means that reading the Bible in any written language is very difficult. There's a lot of barriers to understanding.
So for the uneducated, of which I'm highly educated on this subject, so you guys are translating the Bible. It's not like a bunch of pictures of hands, is it?
It's not pictures of hands. It is video of hands and faces. So that's the other thing is sign language isn't about the hands. It's actually mostly about the face. Almost 80% of the communication that is happening is from body language, eye gaze, all these things, and the hands just help communicate. There are stories of deaf people being able to communicate an entire story without using their hands at all to someone else who has no clue what the story is. And they can communicate fantastically through gesturing, through their face and their body, entire stories. So the hands are actually just help the communication. 80% of the language is on the body, not on the hands.
That's incredible. You guys, you were talking about being where you guys have been is in the, what do we call that? The Philippines. But I was trying to think of the generic, in that area. And tell us again, like it's doing it there is different than like Bethany back there that's learning American Sign Language.
Yeah, so in the Philippines, there's Filipino Sign Language is the major sign language in the Philippines. There are over 400 sign languages in the world. We're still discovering more as we speak. We are still learning more about sign languages. It's a relatively new field. So yeah, when I work in another country, I might be working in like Thai Sign Language with my mixture of Filipino Sign Language, American Sign Language, and Korean Sign Language, just because that's an influx. It's like a pigeon that just starts. So it can be very confusing, but yes.
That's amazing.
There's a lot of different languages and a lot of different ways of communicating, yeah.
And so you guys were working on both learning sign language, but then translation work, for the Filipino people. And now some things have started to adjust because you actually, though, as you were getting into it, you found out there were other kind of fields that wait, this isn't being taken care of. Talk about that.
Right. I mean, probably the easiest way is to tell a story.
Yeah.
So
Just kidding.
he can interpret for.
Yes.
Don't really. It'll be really distracting for everyone. They would just watch him and pay no attention to what I was saying. So one Christmas, we were at a deaf church for a Christmas party, and we saw a young man. He was in his early 20s who was sitting kind of to the side, and some of the other people around him were almost repeating what the pastor was saying. And it's all in sign language, but they were, re-signing it and making sure he understood. And we were wondering, what's happening over there? And his mother was with him. His mother was hearing. And so the other deaf people talked to us, and his mom and Terry had a conversation. And he was in his 20s. I don't remember, 21, 22, somewhere around there. And he had no language. He was just learning sign language.
At 20-something.
At 20-something. And he was learning because the pastor of this deaf church was going to his house and teaching him. And he hadn't learned sign language before because his mother was afraid for his well-being, and so she hadn't sent him to school. So he had been at home with his mom, and in an all-hearing community, he couldn't hear the language being spoken to him, so he had no way of learning that language. And there was no one around him signing, and he wasn't sent to school. I think he had gone three years total out of, the 20-something years of his life. He had been able to go to school. And so although he was learning sign language now in his 20s, the pastor was going and trying to teach him, his learning was different than someone who had grown up with language. To get a little bit into the science of it, our acquisition, our learning of language happens at the same time that our brain is forming. And so there are connections between the language that we use and learning to speak, learning to understand, and the formation of pathways in our brain and the maturity of a brain. And so for this young man, his brain had fully formed because he had grown up, but there was no language linked with that. So when he was learning language in his 20s, he was not able to still understand the pastor who was signing to him. And we found the same thing when we were showing the Bible translations. So the team would work really hard. Terry would be helping them. They'd get a finished product. This is this passage about Jesus healing the deaf man in Filipino sign language. You can show it, and the signers who had learned sign language growing up, they got it. It was that impact of, oh my gosh, I can finally get it. I can finally understand who Jesus is. I couldn't when it was in this other language, but now it's in my language.
Wow.
All of those stories we want to hear. And then we saw over and over again that there was this other group who didn't get it still, that they were still trying to figure out what was happening in this story, even though it was in sign language, in their sign language. And it was because they hadn't started learning until they were teenagers or adults. In the Philippines, this is, how many? He's better at the numbers of this one.
There's about 600 to 800,000 deaf people in the Philippines. Statistically, we've guessed at that number, but it's a pretty good guess. There's also, the only statistic I could find is there's about 100 to 150,000 signers. So that leaves about 500,000 to 600,000 deaf people that have no language, and that's just in the Philippines. That's just one country.
So wait, say that again. That's 600,000 that are, let's call it 600,000, that are deaf, but only 150,000 of them actually get, understand, and do the sign language thing somewhat proficiently.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So God really touched my heart with this. And over the course of our time there, this is happening all over the world. I mean, it's happening in the other countries visited. It's not something unique to the Philippines. And I really felt like the Lord was calling me to figure out what to do. So that set me on a trajectory of trying to look into, okay, like let's see what we're supposed to do, and tried to look for ministries that were doing it, tried to look into the research, what do the experts tell us is supposed to be done? And there wasn't an answer to that question.
Beautiful.
So that's going to be my thing moving forward, which this time has been like a turning point for us. I was working on the translation with Terry. He's going to continue working directly on translation. And I'm going to turn my focus a little bit to figure out what do we do for the rest? What do we do for those who didn't have access to language as children, whose parents didn't learn to sign, who weren't sent to school or weren't sent to a school where there was sign language, who have no access to even communicating their basic needs or understanding love.
So you're going to care about the marginalized of the marginalized.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That started you on a journey. I've got to do research. Somebody's got to help me. At least, well, how do I do this? And tell us a little bit about this story. I love this story.
So when I was researching, there's not a lot that I found, really. And there was one name that kept coming up as someone who has actually spent their career in science researching how deaf people who are starting to learn language as teenagers or adults, how they learn language. And she's based in University of California, San Diego. And so almost everything I could find was written by her, or she was one of the co-authors. Like, she was on it every time. And so we had gotten to the point where we knew I needed to join a research program. So I'm going to be going to get my PhD because I need some platform to be able to research this. And I had an interview at UC San Diego and with her lab, and I thought, well, this will be good for networking. Like, it'll be good to meet her, to know. But the Lord had different plans, and he swung that door wide open. So I've been invited to go to UCSD to work in her lab, to learn directly from her. Like I said, she is basically the only expert in the world on this, the only one who's not just done a study on it, but this is what she studies. She just got a new grant from the National Institute of Health, which is looking at, it's a 3-year longitudinal study, so it's looking at the same kids in school as they learn language starting at these later ages. That's what I wanted to do in Asia, and so I talked to her about that. I said, oh, that kind of study is exactly what I've written up as my research proposal, except doing it in Asia. And she said, oh, well, that fits into what I'm doing with the grant. So we can use grant money to put you on a plane. You can use equipment from the lab. We can fly you there so you can get your data, and then she will help me interpret it. So I get to really sit under her, learn from the best, and the Lord has opened that door in every way for us to be just in the place where I can actually do the thing that he called me to do.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, you can clap. That's all right. So I think I would like to learn there. So, okay, good. I'll give you some money to do it and learn from the very best in the world. Yeah. That's not bad. Yeah. That's outstanding. So you guys will be leaving us here shortly to do some traveling, maybe back and forth some. You're out raising money and whatnot in some other places. And then in August, you take off. Meanwhile, you're continuing. You just finished your master's degree in theology or Bible something, yes?
Biblical studies, yes.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you.
And did you say thank you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And meanwhile, tell us, because as you're translating the Bible, you're not giving verse 1 and then verse 2. You're telling stories. Tell us just a little bit about how the translation work that you're doing is different than maybe what Gary and Peggy Rosensteel are doing in Papua New Guinea.
Yes. Okay. So my job as a consultant is to go in and help a team who's doing the translation work. You're never going to see my face with sign language on a Bible. That would be a very bad idea. So we have the deaf who actually do the translation work. They're signing and on video, and it's their language in their community impacting their nation. And I'm just there to serve them, help them to understand the Bible. So, I've gone to get my master's. I've done 5 years of training to be able to go in and say, yes, this is correct. Ask lots of questions. What does this mean? How does this relate? Basically, just really get in the nitty-gritty and study every sign, every eyebrow raise, every twist of the tongue, the lips, whatever it is, the shoulders, and I ask detailed questions about all of that to make sure that what they're signing is actually what the Bible in the Greek and the Hebrew says. And so that's my role. Is that answering your question? No. Gotcha.
No, that was awesome. However, tell us.
So
Yes, I'm
one of the
asking about
things,
this.
one of the things
He knows even the sign.
that would have been helpful if you would have done that. Then I would have known
sorry.
exactly what you're meaning. So he's talking about chronological Bible translation in some of the languages. In some of the languages, it doesn't mean that, and we won't go there. So in the CBT model, it's telling stories. It's going through and picking out key stories out of the Bible to communicate basically the progress, the complete understanding of the gospel. From God created the world, God created man and woman, they've sinned, they've fallen, all the way up to Jesus died and the apostles started a church. So it's that whole holistic view, but taking selections out of the Gospels and out of the Old Testament. Because if we were to translate the entire Bible, it would take decades to do it for each language. And what we want right now is we want people to understand Jesus, who Jesus is, and get that to them as quickly as possible. So taking out about 110 stories and giving that to the deaf right now, they're able to understand who Jesus is, and they're able to understand who God is and how he relates to them. And that takes maybe 5 years to complete. And so we're getting the Bible out quickly to those people so that they can evangelize, so they can build churches, so they can do amazing things. And then after those are done, if they want, they can continue and translate entire books. That's actually what's happening in the Philippines. They've gotten 45 stories of the CBT, the Chronological Bible Translation, and now the next step after they're trying to do 2 programs where they're going to continue with the stories, but they're also going to translate every verse of the Bible,
Beautiful.
every book.
That's awesome. Is that not awesome? Are we missing anything? They need $200-ish a month.
$242 a month, yes.
And then some big chunk for something. I forget what that was
So
for.
for our move to San Diego, because we were in the Philippines, we don't actually own that much here. A lot of it's borrowed, like our car and everything else. So we're actually needing funds to be able to live in America again, especially in California. So we're raising about $18,000, $19,000 now for the things we need for
So
California.
a chunk of change, and then $240 or something a month in terms of your monthly support, which is way down from where it was just a couple of months ago. I mean, like, you guys have raised a lot of money.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Our monthly support being at $242, it's amazing. It's a story of God's provision. And also, we set up this launch account for vehicle and household setup, and we sent it out, and about this week, and within this week, 30% of it has been met. So the Lord is providing in just real ways through his body and through his people, and it's been very encouraging.
Awesome. That's Terry and Rachel. Thank you, guys.